This is TWiT.
AMD has not stopped bringing the news. They finally came up with a launch date for the Radeon RX Vega 64 and Vega 56. We got specs, we got prices. We know exactly how much power they're going to consume, which is a staggering amount by contemporary graphics card values. What we don't have, though, is benchmarks. It seems like AMD's being really solid on making sure the benchmarks don't hit until after the pre-orders or with the pre-orders.
Perhaps. I don't actually know what the pre-orders are yet for Ryzen, or for Vega at least. Yeah, right. It's odd, right? So they've detailed the specs and the clocks and the pricing and these weird bundle deals and stuff, but they're very particular about the performance data that they showed. So last weekend I was in LA and I was talking to AMD directly about it, and they kind of nudged their way through pricing by talking about the idea of 99th percentile minimum frame rates and how this applies to variable refresh rate displays and stuff like that, right? So the general idea is if you have a variable refresh rate display, a FreeSync display in this case, that has a 3440 by 1440 resolution, high-end enthusiast monitor, and it has a variable refresh rate of 48 to 100. If you are inside that range, your gaming performance should be quite good. If you're below that, it has the possibility of tearing or stuttering, and it's a worse experience. So they basically were comparing the RX Vega 64 to the GTX 1080 purely on what is the kind of bottom 1% frame rate of both of these platforms. And obviously the winner in the games they selected and the settings they selected was the Vega 64.
Shocking.
Yes, weird, right? And there's some validity to that argument, that as long as you are within the right FPS range for your setup, whatever it happens to be, that any performance you get above that may be less useful than anything else, right? So if you're on a 60 hertz monitor and you play games with VSync on, then every frame rate improvement you see over 60 is kind of useless, right? Unless you enable fast sync or enhanced sync or these other technologies, and you start to get into a whole bunch of difficulties. But that's the reason we use average frame rates, why we look for frame variances and deviations of frame times, is not because we as reviewers and analysts and all that goodness and enthusiasts that follow all this stuff don't understand that sometimes going above a certain amount is useless. It's that we can't predict everybody's setup, right? So right now, 34 by 40, you can get 144 hertz screens. So now all of a sudden, the question becomes, okay, on a G-Sync monitor, you can go up to 144 hertz and still be in variable refresh. So now the average frame rate and how high it can go is going to matter more than it did in AMD's kind of created 48 to 100 hertz scenario. So we don't have the cards yet. We'll have the cards soon. You've seen our Frontier Edition testing. I guess it's worth talking a little bit on the specs and how they actually change from the Frontier Edition, because they are different. There's an air-cooled variant and a water-cooled variant. The clock speeds are higher on the RX cards than the Frontier Edition cards by a little bit. And what's interesting is actually, if you look at that table, the boost clock of the RX Vega Air is listed at 1546, but the boost clock of the Vega Frontier Edition Air was listed at 1600. So in theory, you would think actually the RX Vega 64 Air is slower, but they're actually changing the way they're reporting clock speeds with this release as well. The RX Vega marks the first time AMD will begin to report average typical clock speeds as boost clocks. So the clock speed you should actually see your GPU run at while gaming is 1546. Whereas previously, even as recently as the Vega Frontier Edition, that 1600 megahertz mark was the peak clock that it might hit in a perfect environment.
For several seconds.
Right, exactly. Yes, correct.
Before actually doing much of the game.
So the clock speeds should be more indicative of real world performance with RX Vega than they were in Frontier Edition, and that's good. Because if you look at like the liquid cooled card 1677 boost clock, that's actually higher than I think our overclocked liquid cooled Vega Frontier Edition testing looked. So, there's a chance that we see some noticeable performance improvements with these cards, on the order of 7 to 12% over what we tested on Frontier Edition. They do have half the memory, 8 gigs instead of 16. It's running at the same speed, same TDP concerns, basically 350 watts for the liquid cooled and 300 watts for the air cooled. And then that new guy, the Vega 56, which by the way, the Vega 64 doesn't stand for 64-bit. It doesn't stand for 64 clock deviations. It stands for 64 compute units, which have 64 stream processors in them. So you can kind of do the math and figure out how they get to, how we get to 4096 GPU cores. It's a little odd for them to suddenly use a specification in the title. I just think it also kind of sounded neat. Vega 64, Vega 56. But the 56 is an interesting part because its TDP is much more reasonable, 210 watts. The clock speeds are lower, but it's going to be $399. So it's competing against the GTX 1070. And apparently it's, according to what AMD has told me, it's going to win against the 1070. All they'll say about the Vega 64 is that it will be competitive with the 1080, whereas they claim that Vega 56 will win and beat the 1070, and it should have a potential substantial amount of overclocking headroom. But I mean, it's they look good. The cards, the standard model of the Vega 64 and 56 just looks like the Radeon reference design we've seen for a very long time now, which is unfortunate. They have they have the liquid cooled that has the shiny silver shroud with the red Radeon logo in the corner, which I really like. And then they have the limited edition air cooled, but it's going to be $100 more. And, I think they only plan on having it available through September or something like that. So it's going to be a little bit harder to get a hold of. But then the partner cards from Asus and whatnot will be out sometime in September as well.
They're beautiful cards. I mean, I love the design all the way across. I'm curious.
I really do.
I'm very curious to see what the delta in gaming performance is between the Frontier Edition and the RX Vega 64. And as someone who just bought a 1070, I'm really curious to see what the RX Vega 56 performance looks like, and if they beat it, by how much they beat it at. Do you think NVIDIA is going to turn around and have a GTX 1090 sitting in the wings ready to go to sort of one up AMD, or do you expect them to just kind of wait patiently to see whether or not AMD can deliver enough volume to even keep their prices in line during the launch of the product? And because that's something we've seen so often, even when we're not having Bitcoin bumps, where there's a new GPU launched and they sell all 6 of them, and then everybody's either selling them for a significant, VIG over the MSRP, or you just simply can't get them for several weeks. I mean, too early to tell at this point?
Well, so I would say in the last week or so, we've seen the coin mining stuff kind of level off a little bit and actually regress some, which is good. In other words, based on our testing, the value of the performance of a 1080 Ti for coin mining through something like NiceHash has gone from about $10 per day to about $250 per day. Which is, bad for people who invested in mining, but great for people who actually want to buy video cards for graphics. As we looked around yesterday, you could actually find 1080 Ti's and 1080s, within $10, $20 of MSRPs, which is way better than what we've seen in the past. So hopefully that keeps up. I will say that I don't expect NVIDIA to make any response to this release immediately, or really maybe even through the end of the year, right? So if the 1080 is competitive in price, they'll lean on some of their features and capabilities. They may do some driver tweaks. They may work with some partners to do $20 and $30 rebates, so the prices go down a little bit more. But they still have the 1080 Ti. Like the Vega 64 is not going to beat that. So they still will have the crown of the enthusiast gaming graphics card. And in terms, but on the mining thing again, I will say that, like, talking with AMD's product managers and kind of the executives trying to figure out how they were going to do this launch, it was really hard to come up with a plan to launch a new product when a month ago cards were selling for double what they were supposed to be selling for. And you have to come out and determine what the pricing scheme for your product is going to be. And as a company, you don't want to sell it for too little, thinking that, knowing that you could have made, $100 extra per card, in that interim time frame. But then you also have to be careful about how you market it, so that, like, because reviewers, when we look at this card, we will look at it as, you know, MSRPs are this. Yes, the ecosystem is set up this way, but we believe it will return to, you know, state X.
Right.
And so it would be an interesting thing for them, and that's kind of where those Radeon packs come into play. I don't know if you saw what even that stuff was about. If you pay $100 more for your graphics card, which is essentially what it is, if you pay $599 for the Vega 64 air cooled instead of $499, or $499 instead of $399 for the Vega 56, you get access to these Radeon packs, which allow you to optionally get $200 off of a Radeon FreeSync enabled monitor, $100 off of a Ryzen 7 CPU and motherboard combo, and 2 included games, Wolfenstein 2 and Prey. So if you want to buy that hardware, it's a pretty good deal, right? You're paying $100 more for a card to get $300 in discounts towards other hardware and 2 free games. Now, if you don't want this hardware, or you don't want these games, you are essentially being asked to pay $100 more for just the card, which you can do. That's the only way to get the limited edition. It's the only way to get the liquid cooled card for the foreseeable future. And the worry is, you know, so these cards will exist in 2 different states at Newegg. You'll have the $499 option of the Vega 64 and the $599 option of the Vega 64. And the allocation of those 2 things will be very interesting. If we come to a point where you cannot buy the card for $499, but there's plenty available for sale for $599 with this optional bundle, then that tells us that, you know, AMD is just, they want to get $100 more out of each card, but they didn't want the stigma of being priced at $599 to kind of follow them around. So they're kind of doing this workaround way of doing it. If both versions are available for, you know, equal amounts of time, then okay, they're balancing out. I think it was a pretty good hedge play on AMD's part, because it allowed them to sell a card at $599. If they were selling at $599 continually, there's no reason for them to back it off to $499. But this gives them the ability to move cards back and forth between those 2 price points based on the position of you know, what the sales happen to look like, without having to eat crow of suddenly launching at $599 and having an immediate price drop to $499, which would be, you know, pretty damaging, I think, from an external standpoint. So we'll have to see. These go on sale on August 14th. Our reviews will be live on August 14th. And we'll be able to tell you what we recommend.